So we're talking about character design today. And as I mentioned before, we're going to start thinking about like what we want our games that we're creating in this class to look like, and where they're set, and what's happening in them. And one entry point, it's not the only entry point, but one entry point is through the main character. And so when we start thinking about who the main character in the game is, we can think about like where they might live, what the functionality they might have, what style of game. All these different things can come out of thinking about what this character is like. You can kind of like, as you start to think about this character, you don't have to commit to anything, especially this early on in the semester. If you have other ideas that you want to pursue in the future, that's totally cool. But we're going to just look at a few different aspects of character design and think about how they might help us in creating our games. Okay, so here's PacMan. In this image, we see PacMan as well as the ghost characters from the classic arcade game PacMan from 1980. One of the things that's interesting about this that you guys probably can tell, there's not a lot of detail here, and PacMan has less detail in some respects than the other characters. PacMan only consists of one color, and PacMan doesn't have any eyes. It's just, PacMan, the main character, is just a circle with a mouth, basically. The other characters, or the enemies in the game, have more detail. They have eyes, and they have two different colors, and the contrast between each character is very high. Each one has a specific color that's different from the other colors, so it's very easy to see them on the screen. So just from like something very simple like this, we can see a lot of good principles of character design. The main being, so there's two functions that our character performs in the game. One is giving us an avatar to identify with in the game, and so with PacMan, the PacMan character is the character that we can control, and it's also the brightest color. It's this bright yellow, and it doesn't really have any detail, so we kind of just can invent whatever we want as far as who we think PacMan is. The other thing is that it is going to tell us the functionality of the character. And PacMan does this in a couple really simple ways. One is it shows us which direction we're facing, just by which direction the mouth is in. And then it also tells us the sort of like main goal or main function of this character is just to eat the white dots that make up the PacMan maze. And so just with like some very, very simple graphics, we're communicating to the player what they're supposed to be doing and what the goal of the character is. So with PacMan, the goal is just to eat all of the dots. There really isn't, other than avoiding the ghosts and not dying, that's the only goal in the game. And so the PacMan is just reduced to the absolute basics of what makes the character function. So when we think about character design, we want to think about these two things. The player is going to be controlling the character, and we want to indicate what the functionality of that character is. In games where there's multiple characters, they might have like different styles of functionality, and that's another way that you can differentiate these characters from each other, like if you can choose, a few different styles of play at the beginning of the game. So PacMan is simple, but the color makes the character stand out in the game world, and it's easy to identify on a screen. And it has a large mouth that makes it clear that the primary objective of PacMan is to eat the dots. So moving forward a little bit in video game history, we have Mario. And I think Mario is a really good example of character design because it's not that much more like detail or information than PacMan, but it actually sets up the Mario world in a really interesting way. So Mario is pretty simple, but there are some specific details. Like we can see that Mario has a hat, and Mario has like these buttons, he's wearing overalls, and he has a mustache. Like there's these very specific identifying details for the character that are kind of funny. You can think a lot about what these details might mean. Like you could say the overalls kind of like associate Mario with like a working class, like he's a plumber. or laborer or something like that. But it's also just like kind of funny, and it sets up the world that basically like these elements don't necessarily really make sense together. Like there's no real reason why a plumber would be fighting mushrooms. That's just like what's happening in Mario. And so it kind of sets up this like whimsical, nonsensical, fun world that we're playing in. So even though it's a little bit, it's not, there isn't this like necessarily specific relationship between the detail of Mario and what he can do. It sets up this bigger theme of the Mario world. So moving back in time a little bit, we have Space Invaders. Again, we just see like the most simple graphics that tell us something about what's happening with this character, and we can identify it with the spaceship because there's nothing really about it that would prevent us from being part of that spaceship. In early video game systems like PacMan, Space Invaders, Mario, to a certain extent, they're sort of limited by the graphical power of those systems. So the number of colors was limited, the amount of physical space that we could represent on the screen was very limited, and the processing power, how much we could draw on a screen at the time that these were made, which is 40, 50 years ago, was also very limited. And so that kind of forced game designers to use these constraints to make clever decisions about their character designs. And so this is sort of like, the constraints inspire creative choices to get around those constraints. Now, these days, we really don't have those constraints when it comes to game design. We still have some constraints, like, we can't create completely... Well, I guess we don't really have any constraints anymore if you have like one of the new graphics cards and you're playing on ultra high settings with HD textures and lighting and all these other graphic effects that we have now. We can almost really recreate like cinema, like video or film quality graphics in an interactive video game, which is pretty crazy. We don't have a lot of limitations anymore when it comes to character design. But we still can think about these early examples of how they use very limited space to communicate their ideas. So moving forward a little bit in time, let me just check the chat. So moving forward a little bit in time, this is the game Canabalt, which I don't know if you guys would be familiar with this game. It was kind of a big deal when it came out, but I don't think it's really stayed as relevant as I think it kind of seemed like it might. But in this game, basically this is like one of the first endless runner games. And the character in this game, again, is very simple. So we have like very detailed scenes here. We're not, in this case, sort of limited by the graphics of the computer. So this was made for mobile devices, which actually at this point in time in 2009 had pretty sophisticated processors compared to computers that we had in the 80s. And so you can see we can have a lot of detail in the scene, but the character is still made to be very simple. So the character is still this sort of like random person in a suit who could really be anybody. And so we see that in different contexts in games as well as in animation, where the character is represented very simply while the scenery or the other aspects of the game become more complex. The style of pixel art also is still used often, like in games like this that are sort of trying to reference video game history. We'll see that retro aesthetic or pixel art style that's kind of an homage to these earlier games that we looked at. Another game, Limbo from 2011. This is a really fun indie game. This one I would expect that some of you guys have played, but maybe not everybody. This one is really cool. It has like very moody, very like highly textured graphics, and it has like great sound design. Like everything about this game is really, really well designed. But you can see the character is still very, very simple. compared to, if you think about that character compared to Mario or PacMan or these other characters, it still has like this one very specific identifying aspect, which is the two bright eyes. So we can always see where the player is in the scene, even though most of the game is all these really these changing hues of black and gray. The character always stands out because of these bright eyes that he has. Other than that, it's just a silhouette of a child, basically. So again, anybody could imagine being that child as they're playing the game. So again, even though we have these very complex and detailed and nuanced graphics in Limbo, we still have a very simple design for the main character. The Binding of Isaac is another really good indie game that combines a lot of elements of game design that are really cool, like roguelike design and the dungeon crawler style of gaming. And the character is really remarkable for its design as well, because it's so simple, but it has this really great functionality, which is that the tears in the character's eyes are its sort of like weapon in the game. It's what it uses to play the game. But it also kind of tells us something about the character itself, the story of the game, which is the character is very sad. And so the functionality and the aesthetic and everything is kind of like wrapped into one, where we can kind of like feel for the character. We have this like emotional sort of bond with the character because the character is crying, but it's also the power of the character or the weapon that the character uses in the game. That's another really, fun indie game. I think probably, I'm sure a lot of you guys have played that one. Inside, yeah, also is I think it's made by the same company. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think it is, and it's also a really good game. All right. So video games tend to borrow styles from different sources, like cartoons or comics, anime, film, other visual references. In Binding of Isaac, it's referencing sort of a comic book style. It almost looks like web comics from the 2000s or something like that. And it has built into it this origin story that kind of brings the player in to identify with the character. So there's like a lead up of this sort of like different scenes showing the story behind the character. And so we understand why the character looks the way it does and why we should identify with that. So a lot of these ideas are kind of summarized in the Scott McCloud Understanding Comics book, which is the assignment, the research assignment for this week. And in it, he talks about cartoons and iconography and this sort of spectrum or gradient between realism and iconography or cartoon stylization. And so you can see this chart he has here. On the left side, we have like a photograph of a man. And in that photograph, there's some details that make this person specific, that gives us an idea of who this person is. So on the left, we have realism. And then we see this like gradient across different sort of comic book styles or levels of stylization until we get to, the right side, where we just have the most basic cartoon of a person's face with just eyes and a mouth. And in that gradient, we have these different ways of identifying with the character. So the more realistic the character is, the more we might feel like, it's an authentic character, that it belongs in a specific context. And we might understand that character in a different way. As we get to the other side of this sort of cartoon or icon style, the character becomes more universal. It's easier for us as a player or as a reader to identify with a character that doesn't have any identifying traits, because we can imagine ourselves easily being that character just based on the visual cues. So most of us probably wouldn't necessarily see ourselves as this man on the left, but almost everyone can see themselves as the cartoon on the right. And so McCloud kind of establishes this system of iconography that we can think about when we're designing our characters. So these aesthetic choices like are references maybe to films or cartoons or other visual mediums, as well as this sort of level of realism will give people a cue as to what to expect from the game. So if you want a player to expect a hyper-realistic experience, then you would have very high-level graphics with very specific details and, you know, very realistic characters. And so that prompts the player to expect the gameplay to be very realistic and very authentic to real life. If you want the gameplay to be more sort of cartoonish, or, you know, maybe you're going for something that's kind of like dark, or you're going for something that's more like over the top or exaggerated in different ways, maybe there's magic in the game or other things like that, the aesthetic choices and the characters that you design should also prompt the user to have those expectations. This doesn't just apply to character design, it also applies to non-player characters or other visual components in the game. We want to have this kind of synthesis between what our character looks like and what the setting looks like. We'll talk a little bit about that in future lectures. But we want to be like basically using the aesthetics to give the player cues as to what to expect in the game. Another reference that I like is this design process by the artist Tato. And they designed these sort of Overwatch characters, these like cartoons based on Overwatch characters. And there's this great blog post. It's very simple and short, going over the design process. And I talk about this in the character design lab, where you'll design your own character as well. But I think these are some, you know, these are not every design tip or every design approach that you could take, but I think they're really good in terms of their simplicity. The first one that they talk about is shapes, and talk about three basic shapes: a round or circle shape, a square, and a triangle. And they talk about what those shapes kind of signify or mean to them as a designer. So round tends to be more charismatic, harmless, endearing characters. Box is reliable, uniform, traditional, and triangle is cunning, dynamic, or competent. So you might not agree with those. Those shapes may give you different feelings, but you can see where the designer came up with these ideas. And then combining the shapes, we can get different variations of those traits into one character. They also talk about silhouettes. So having, blocking out the character into a silhouette should give you a sense of who that character is. So all of these characters are just as recognizable without color or detail as they are with it. And then they talk about color. Having these kind of guidelines, again, there's no like universal guideline that everybody should follow, but by creating guidelines for yourself as a designer, it can help lead to consistency across your designs. So they use a couple rules. The one is the 60-30-10 rule. So the main color is 60% of the character, second color is 30%, and the last color is 10%. So having a dominant color, a secondary color, and then like a highlight color. And you can see how that affects these three designs. And then for two colors, they use the 70-30 rule. And so, you know, again, this isn't a rule that everybody has to follow in any design process. It's just a good example of a kind of rule that will help you create consistency across your designs. And this is something that, you know, people will develop on their own as they create characters. They also have a cool influence map where they show the different influences on the character design. And so we'll do something similar like this for our characters design lab. I don't expect you to, you know, make it exactly like this and spend a lot of time. Like, obviously, they spend a lot of time like kind of like synthesizing all of their designs in this one drawing. But we will just look at some references and include those references in the post. So what I want to emphasize in the character design lab, I'll go over this a lot, is the iterative process. So iterative is a big word that means doing something over and over again or repeating a process, but then adding variation. And so this is something that all designers, developers, you know, people who are creating something will learn to do is not just settling for the first drawing or the first design they think of, but iterating, thinking, what would it look like if I changed these colors, or change these shapes, or change these details. And you might end up going back to the first drawing that you did, but it's through that process, through iterating, repeating and adding variation to a design, that you'll discover what all the different possibilities for that design are. And that will either lead you to change the design, or it will kind of reaffirm the initial instincts that you might have had. Okay, so as far as making game art, we're obviously using Pascal. Most of you guys have already probably opened it and tried it out for the art intro. We've talked a little bit about using other editors, which is totally fine. If you guys are more comfortable in other editors, we've talked a little bit about Sprite. That's a good one if you want to spend a little bit of money. I think it's like $20 to get that program, which is very similar to Pascal, but has some more features that could be useful. Sorry? Oh, Sprite. I'll put it in the chat. I'll see if I'll just get a link to it. I think some people already have this. A bunch of people last semester had it as well. So it's a very popular editor for pixel art. Let's see how much it costs. It's $20. You could probably get it on sale. I guess Labor Day already happened, but sometimes there are sales. Yeah. It's very similar to Pascal. It just has a lot more features, which is why it costs more. But anyway, whatever you want to use. Some people might, not even want to do pixel art. If you want to do Photoshop or Illustrator or Procreate or Inkscape or GIMP or Krita or whatever it is that you use, you should be able to use it for this class. The reason that I've been using Pascal or a pixel art editor is because most of those editors are designed with games in mind, and so they have functionality that makes it easy to export the art to use in a game. And we'll see that in the labs. You'll create things like sprite sheets to make your animations. Also, in terms of the sizing, it's a lot easier. Like when you're drawing in Photoshop, you tend to draw things at a really large resolution, but then when you want to put it in the game, you're going to have to size it down a lot, and that's going to change the quality of the art. If you start working in pixel art, the quality of the art doesn't really change whether you size it up or down, because you have hard edges. So you don't want to design something really small and then make it huge, but you have a little bit more leeway there. But you guys, I encourage you guys to work in whatever it is that you prefer, and then we can figure out how to get stuff into the game. It may take a little more time, but it's possible. And a lot of designing, a lot of game design and art and all these things is a process of trial and error. So you might work with something and realize it doesn't work and then go back and try something again. But that doesn't mean, it was pointless to do the first design. You probably learned a lot through that design process that you can apply to the next design process. So, I encourage you guys to just try whatever. And if it doesn't work, we can always go back and figure out how to make things work the next time around. So again, I do encourage you to use Pascal or Sprite or something like that, because it's going to make the sort of pipeline between your art and design process and building the game a lot simpler. So even if you don't love pixel art, it'll make things a little bit easier just for this semester. But if you really want to change the art or use something else, it is possible. We just need to get it into the right format for the game. So just keep that in mind. I just that using the Pascal or Sprite or a pixel art editor is going to make things a lot easier in terms of getting your art into a game, but it's not required. Exactly. But yeah, so I'm encouraging and emphasizing that this is a good way for this class, this will be a good process, but also saying that if you really are like, I've made these awesome Photoshop designs and I want to use them, you know, that's fine. That's something that we can explore as well. Let me just check the chat and then we'll keep going. Okay, go for it. Yeah, that's the plan. That's the goal. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Okay. Okay, so a few resources. I already showed you guys this design tips. Designing a character, this is just a YouTube video. Let me mute it and try to get past this ad. I feel like these ads are getting longer. Yeah. Yeah. You used to not, like you could turn ads off, but you can't do that anymore. So sometimes even my videos that have like 20 views have ads, which is like insane. Anyway, this is a game design or character design tutorial. They kind of go over, this is another one where they have like a very specific aesthetic that they work with, and then they kind of go through designing the character. And the thing I like about this is they use a lot of like layers, and so they're doing a lot of sketches with just basic shapes and then drawing detail on top of that. That's a really good approach. It goes into a lot more detail than I go into in my character design video, so I think that's a good reference. This I've linked to before, just the Pascal tutorial series. I cover probably a lot of the stuff that they go over in here, but this is just like a whole, I guess this is just the first video, but there's a playlist. Yeah, how do we look at this playlist? Oh, maybe we go to here, playlists. Huh. Can I search? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is just a playlist that has like a bunch of different videos. I should link directly to this playlist. I should update that. On using Pascal and creating pixel art. So it goes into a little bit more detail than I'll go into in my videos. And then this one I think is another sort of, not tutorial, but essay on character design with a bunch of different examples. A lot of the same stuff that we've talked about, but it goes into some different concepts, different ideas, and different techniques as well. So that's another good article to check out. These are just resources, things that I thought were interesting. They're not required, but you know, they could be useful. And I think, yeah, that's it. So any questions on character design or anything else? It kind of depends, like, it depends on the aesthetic that you're going for. I think like the character that I did for the videos for the lab is like 64 by 64. And I started designing at 32 by 32 because that's like the default. But I changed to 64 by 64 because I just couldn't really draw at that small. Like I didn't want to be, some pixel artists like literally click on the different pixels. But I tend to use a tablet and draw, and at 32 pixels, it was just too small for me to actually be able to draw something like draw a curve or a line that looked, good. So I increased the size to 64, but I designed most of the scenery in 32 because there's not quite as much detail. But it depends on your game. Like, you might want to draw your scenery with lots and lots of details, or if you're drawing like a full background, obviously that would have to be bigger. But I usually try to start with 32 because if you can do it with 32, you can size it up, and then it's really, really small. We don't really have to worry that much about like efficiency with games, but as a person who's been making games for a long time, I used to really be obsessed with getting things as small as possible, and those tendencies are still in there when I'm starting to design something. So starting with 32 by 32 is good. If you can't get the level of detail that you want, then just go bigger. And if you're drawing a whole background, you can make it really big. Like, you could draw it at 1024 by 1024 or 1920 by 1080, whatever you want to do. But when it comes to like the component parts, you don't want to draw it like way bigger than what it's actually going to be like in the game, because then you have to size it down, and that looks a lot worse than sizing something up, especially if you're using pixel art. But it just, it kind of depends. You can try different stuff, and then you can always resize things, or you might have to redraw something. But I tend to try to do things pretty quickly so I can get a sense of what it looks like, and then add details later once like when you're building a game. I should link to, there's actually a really good article. You know the game Stardew Valley? Have you guys played that game? Yeah. 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 It's a great game. And there's a good, I don't know if it was an interview or just an article that they wrote, but the person who made the game spent like 5 years on it. And they did it all by themselves. And one of the things they talk about is how all of the art that they created at the beginning, when they started, by the end, it was really bad because they had gotten so much better at creating pixel art by the end of this process that you could really tell the difference between stuff that they drew 5 years previously to stuff that they were drawing, as the game got closer to being finished. And so they had to go back and redo everything. And that's a pretty common thing when it comes to making a game. The stuff that you make when you first start, once you get to the end of this process, you're going to say, oh, that doesn't really look good anymore. I need to update stuff. So it's a good thing to always be sort of like open to changing things and updating and revising things. It's going to, if you get stuck with like one drawing and you're always just trying to, work around that drawing, that's not always a good design process. So basically, that's like a long way of just saying, don't just... the first drawing that you make, the first design that you make, if it's not perfect, that's okay. Other questions? So check the chat. Can it be an RPG? Yeah, it could be an RPG. When is this due? The character design, well, not everybody's actually going to do the character design, so it doesn't really have a specific due date. So I'm going to stop my